With a gasp, Lydia's eyes blinked open, and she found herself surrounded by a bustling crowd of blurred figures. As she tried to make sense of the moment, she noticed something peculiar about her vision. Objects in her immediate vicinity had a strange, sharp focus, as though they were almost too vividly detailed. However, when she tried to look beyond her immediate line of sight, things became hazy. It was as if she was seeing the world through a narrow tunnel, with only the things right in front of her in clear view. It was disorienting, and she could feel her consciousness struggling to keep lucid. She felt an insistent pull towards something that she couldn't quite explain. Lydia's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this really the astral plane, or was it just a vivid dream? She struggled to remember the spell she had cast, the one that was supposed to allow her to leave her body and explore other planes of existence. As her mind scrambled for the memory of the incantation, she felt a strange sensation wash over her, as if her consciousness was being pulled away. Fear gripped her as things continued to feel out of her control. What if she couldn't find her way back to her body? What if something in this strange world managed to harm her in some way? Her need for some kind of rescue sparked a memory, a tip from her notes that could help her stay grounded in this strange place. She lifted her hand up and concentrated on it until she could see the minute details. Lines on her palm that wavered if her thoughts drifted, the occasional extra finger that she knew did not belong. Finally, she looked solid and real enough, but looking beyond her hand, everything was still a blurry mess. Slowly, she shifted her gaze past her fingers, the world around her sharpening like a camera lens coming into focus. What she saw, however, left her gaping, and Lydia's hand shot up to her mouth to stifle a scream. She was in a theme park, but like none she had ever seen. It was like something out of a horror movie, and Lydia couldn't believe what was happening. The rides were towering into a sickly, green-lit sky, and the clouds were dark and twisted. It was glaringly obvious she was not among the living. They were dead, but not the peaceful kind of dead. Nope, they were all kinds of messed-up horror creatures meandering around on the winding and jagged paths. She felt like she had been dropped in the middle of a nightmare. This place was like nothing she had ever seen before, and it was terrifying. The only thing that kept her from shrieking was the fact that no one seemed to notice her. She was like a ghost herself, standing in the park, with no one as much as glancing at her. The dead just walked past her, as if she wasn't even there, their faces twisted into various expressions of horror or fake joy as they made their way through the twisted paths of the carnival. It was as if she had a force field around her that everyone instinctively avoided. It was all so surreal. She heard the creaking of the wooden roller coaster tracks, the distant sound of flat-sounding screams. The people around her seemed to be going through the motions without any real enthusiasm or excitement. There were no joyful yelps of delight coming from the rides, no sounds of laughter coming from the crowds. It was a strange thing to be completely invisible in a world of the dead, but Lydia couldn't deny that it was also a little bit comforting. At least she wouldn't draw any unwanted attention to herself this way. Slowly but surely, Lydia gained more confidence in the protection spell she had cast and began walking through the park, careful and cautious at first. She took in everything around her with a mix of awe and delighted horror, marveling at the twisted and distorted versions of familiar carnival rides and attractions, but also feeling an underlying sense of unease at the lack of joy and excitement among the parkgoers. Lydia was still too apprehensive to brave the towering, ominous-looking rides, so she checked out the performers and strange attractions instead. Among the bizarre sights she encountered were a skeleton strongman, who was quite literally a skeleton, and lifting the most exaggerated barbell she'd ever seen. An 8-legged tap dancer was next, and Lydia was certain that the extra legs were not props or special effects. The Netherworld's hairiest man had been covered head to ankles in so much hair that there were no defining features of an actual human under it all. As she strolled on, she eventually stumbled upon the games area. She approached a booth with a sign that read, "Whack a Ghost," and watched as a man with a tiny hammer tried to hit gnarled hands that popped up out of holes in the table. The hands quickly wrestled the hammer out of the man's grip and vanished through the holes with malicious snickering. Then her eyes landed on something that nearly stopped her heart entirely. A silhouette of a shape she could never mistake against the canvas flap of the game tent she was in. Her breath was quick, and every hair on her body stood on end. She was pinned down by her terror. This could still be a dream, but it could very well be that she summoned the very thing she had tried to avoid like the plague since she was 15. It was him. Lydia's heart thudded against her chest, as if it was trying to escape her ribcage. She could feel every beat, like a drum roll leading up to a grand finale, her eyes glued to the silhouette, outlined against the canvas like a shadow puppet. Her mind raced, wondering if this was all just a nightmare. But the more she looked, the more she knew it was all too real. Lydia quickly moved past the crowd, keeping the people in the group blocking her as she walked by. She looked around wildly to make sure that her protection spell held, and saw that no one had yet noticed her. Her eyes confirmed her worst fear. Beetlejuice stood out in the open, a lone figure rooted in place like a statue as the other dead people walked by. He didn't seem to notice her as she made her way back a bit more exposed, trying to get a better look at him. She could see that he was dazed, looking out unseeing, his mouth the only thing moving, but she couldn't make out what he muttered. As she got closer, she could see every gruesome detail of his face. The wrinkles on his forehead were more pronounced than she remembered, but his dark circles under his half-lidded eyes were exactly the same. His wild hair stuck out in all directions but was mostly tamed by the hat on his head, and she realized that he was wearing the same jumpsuit that seemed to be the uniform of the carnies working there. Fitting, she thought, as she recalled how he'd emerged out of the model and turned her house into a carnival just like the one she stood in.
"Step right up."
His gruff, lackluster voice finally reached Lydia, as she realized too late that she'd moved closer to him. Much too close.
"Test your strength."
She jolted, thinking maybe he'd finally seen her and just didn't recognize her. It had been almost 30 years ago since they last saw each other, after all. But the ghost that reigned over her nightmares had lost his edge since then, it seemed. His once glinting blue eyes were glazed over, his rough and boisterous voice now subdued to bland murmurs of the same line repeated every few seconds. For a ghost, he'd seemed more alive than anyone Lydia had ever encountered, dead or otherwise. But now, he was just another dead thing, and it seemed oh so wrong. She wondered what had happened to him, how he had ended up like this. Feeling either brave or stupid, Lydia waved a hand over his eyes, but he didn't even blink. Emboldened, she held her breath and walked closer until she was right under his sharp nose. He still didn't seem to notice her. She could smell the sour stench of his breath, a mixture of cigarettes and something else that she couldn't quite place.
"What is that?"
She screamed, and pointed behind him suddenly. She was afraid for a moment that she had truly messed up and that everyone would notice her, especially the ghost she had broken a deal with. But no, nothing happened. It was as if she was invisible. Lydia's eyes drifted towards the game that Beetlejuice was supposed to be enticing people to play. The Test Your Strength booth. She had been hesitant to touch anything since she arrived, but now she considered it. Her eyes lingered on the large mallet in Beetlejuice's hand, torn between just leaving and going along with her ludicrous plan. Lydia's fingers grazed over the gothic-looking mallet as she carefully lifted it from Beetlejuice's grasp, half expecting him to lunge at her any moment. But he remained motionless, lost in his own world. Lydia held the mallet in her hands, surprised at how light it was, considering its massive size. She lifted the mallet with ease, feeling the weightlessness of it. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should play the game or not. With a determined look on her face, she turned her attention back to the strength tester. The bell at the top seemed to taunt her, daring her to try her luck. Lydia knew she could hit her mark, because she would will it to be so. She brought it down with all the strength she could muster, hitting the pad with a resounding thud. The bell at the top of the strength tester rang loudly, announcing her victory. Without a second thought, Lydia immediately swung the mallet back up, preparing to strike the poltergeist if he finally snapped out of whatever trance he was in. Yet he remained still, unresponsive. Lydia blinked and then scoffed. With a sly grin on her face, Lydia shifted her grip on the mallet and took aim at a new target. She wasn't interested in winning a stuffed animal anyway. She had a more satisfying goal in mind. She drew back her arm, and with a mighty swing, the head of the mallet made contact with Beetlejuice's left foot. And it was like a cartoon come to life. Lydia barely glimpsed his eyes widening before his mouth dropped open in a piercing scream while his head spun on his shoulders, and then he launched into the air and bounced on one foot, cursing through his teeth. And Lydia laughed and laughed until Beetlejuice spun around and locked eyes with her. "Oh, shit," Lydia breathed. Blue eyes, once again glinting with malice, flickered across her face with obvious recognition.
You! Oh, shit.
Thank you for listening. You can find the written version of this story by clicking the link in the description. Please like and subscribe for more. And let me know what you think of this story.